I don't know how many of you have a chance to ever read Rabbi Daniel Gordis's Israel from the Inside. It's an email that comes out fairly, you're just stuck up here, sorry about that, that comes out fairly regularly. And what he tries to do in that email is present ways of understanding and seeing the state of Israel from what it's called, from the inside, from how Israelis, or at least he and the people that he brings onto his site through podcasts, through conversations, through interviews and whatever, how they understand Israel, because we get a somewhat biased view, as you know, in our newspapers here outside of the state of Israel. And earlier in the week, which was unbelievably prescient to the events that transpired later on in the week, he called our attention to the Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel. And he said that there was a sentence in the Declaration of Independence for Israel that in his mind did not make sense, or anybody's mind, when you read it the first time. Here's the quote. Listen carefully and see if you can figure out which one he raised as a question. On the 29th November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. Anything strike you? It would be easier, of course, if you were looking at it than just listening to it. But let me read it one more time, a little bit faster. On the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. This General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. What do you think? So one possibility could be as were necessary. What was the state, as we know, of the state of Israel at the time that they proclaimed independence? There were how many Arab nations surrounding them that threatened that on the eve of their declaration, what would happen to them? They were going to be slaughtered, was the language that the Arab nations used. They, of course, were going to be invaded and they were going to be slaughtered. So perhaps that line is in reference to, hey, Israel, if you can fight to do what you can do to save yourself, great, there'll be a Jewish state. If not, well, I don't think they would have said halavai, but one could imagine what they would have said. The line, anybody else want to offer a thought?
Rabbi? All the inhabitants.
Oh, interesting. So there's much commentary on that statement in the declaration that Ben-Gurion, you know that Ben-Gurion had a lot of people who were drafting it, but then Ben-Gurion was the one who at the very end put his finishing touches on that. And he spoke in detail about all the inhabitants of the land, meaning that the state of Israel is both for Jews and for Arabs, for Muslims, for Jews, for Christians, for anybody who lives in the state of Israel. The line that Daniel pointed out was the line at the very end. I'll read it to you again. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. Bob, they can't change their mind. Now, what's the reality that we... Yes, sir. Beautiful. What a fantastic question. Wow. What's your name, sir? What's your name?
He's my cousin.
Well, you're a lucky woman.
He's mine.
Well, it is nice to claim him because he raised exactly the issue. Exactly. We know that, maybe we don't know, but you should know that just 4 months after the declaration, there were members of the State Department of the United States that were working vigorously to upend that declaration, that resolution for the state of Israel to exist as a state. And not only was that happening here in America through the State Department, but we know that from the time in which the UN passed this resolution, what has the UN continued to do with regard to the state of Israel? Everything it can possibly do to undermine the existence of the state of Israel. Now, we know that the UN Resolution 181, commonly called the Partition Plan, was to divide the Palestinian state into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. And the Arab state never came to be because at that moment they rejected the Partition Plan and they attacked, as I said earlier, in 1948. They attacked in 1967, they attacked in 1973, and they continue to attack as recently as 2023 and 2024. So, not only was it that the Arabs didn't agree with it, but we also know that the rest of the world, many in the world, didn't necessarily agree. And Ben-Gurion, in, I think, adding that line, was basically saying that just as easy as the state, and it was not easy at all, was given to the Jewish people, it could easily be revoked, given the history of the way that the world behaved towards Jews. 1975, what happened in 1975 in the UN? Zionism is racism, the beginning of the UN to undo the very resolution. And then just a couple of weeks ago in France, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, allegedly stated at a French cabinet meeting, this is the quote that came out from that, Mr. Netanyahu must not forget that his country was created by a decision of the UN, which we just read. Therefore, this is not the time to disregard the decisions of the UN. What's the implication of that statement by the president of France? Just as the UN passed the resolution then, so too does the UN have the power to undo the resolution today. Now, how many of you know what number state Israel became amongst the 193 countries that are today part of the UN? Was it 190? Was it 180? Was it in the 170s, the 160s? Where in relationship to the 193 countries did Israel become a state, a country? 70 is a good guess. How about 58? So that means that Israel is one of the oldest countries in the world relative to the nations of the UN. And Israel is the only of the 193 countries whose right to exist is regularly challenged, whose legitimacy to be a state for the Jews, the only state for the Jews, is regularly challenged. Now, the president of France made his statement in the context of the UN Resolution 1701. And what was the UN Resolution 1701 for you history buffs? Yes, it was to withdraw Hezbollah from the border between Lebanon and Israel back in 2006, was it? 2000, something like that. I'm not very good with dates. And we know that resolution failed miserably. And Israel has been pushing against that for quite a long time. And we know, right, that the UN and UNIFIL did nothing to change the dynamics on the ground, as we have seen with Israel going into Lebanon recently. So if not directly challenging its right to exist, then the UN clearly and regularly does everything it can to delegitimize it. Most recently, September 18th, there was a vote on the floor of the UN. You know what that vote was for? And let me tell you, before I tell you what the vote was for, how it was voted. 124 countries voted in favor. 14 voted against, and 43 abstentions. What was the vote on September 18th? For the Ir Ha'atika b'Yerushalayim, for the old city in Jerusalem to become Jew-free. Did you read about that in the newspapers here in the United States? Why not? 124 countries in the world voted to remove all Jews from the old city of Jerusalem. 14, September 18th. September 18th. 14 voted against it. 14. And 43 abstentions. While many in the world would rather see a Middle East or certainly a Jerusalem without Israel, without Jews, just this week again, a couple of days ago, we saw how essential Israel is to the Jewish people. After the pogrom in Amsterdam, Israel sent planes, medical help, and intelligence operatives into Amsterdam to rescue its citizens when the police and local citizens did nothing to help innocent Israelis beaten by Arab mobs after a soccer match. Lech lecha me'artzecha, God says to Avraham Avinu, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's home, to the land Erecha, that I will show you, that I will give you. And in that land, Avraham, because you can only do it from the land, you can't do it from the place in which you are in Mesopotamia. In fact, the Midrash comes along and says that Avraham and Sarah would not have merited children had they remained in Mesopotamia. They would not have merited children. They needed to be in a place in which they knew that Jewish children can live and grow and thrive and strive and be strong. And that could only happen, according to the Torah, in a land that is our own. Lech lecha, God says to Avraham, to a place that I will show you and become a great nation, and show the world, v'yeh bracha, that you are a blessing, and that all of humanity will be blessed by you. And that is exactly what Israel has done. Mistakes aplenty. Every country makes mistakes. Do we agree with everything that Israel always does? Oh my God, no. Do we agree with everything that our spouses do all the time? Do we agree with everything that our children do all the time? Do we agree with everything that we do all the time? Nobody is perfect. But the nation of Israel is a nation of blessings for this world. And it is our responsibility, yours and mine and everybody here, to do everything that we can to remind the world that it was the 58th state that was given its right to exist, and nothing and no one will ever take that right away. Shabbat Shalom.